They mocked a man in a wheelchair, bullied a blind veteran, and terrorized a small Vermont diner, but the shadow warriors were about to learn the most brutal lesson of their lives. Behind those dark glasses and gentle smiles sat a legend, Thomas "Iron Horse" Sullivan, one of America's most formidable special forces operators whose missions were so classified, even his medals stayed hidden. For 2 weeks they pushed him, taunted him, never realizing they were playing with fire. Then came the phone call within hours. 40 hardened combat veterans descended on Oak Harbor, men and women who'd followed Sullivan through hell and back, warriors who owed him their lives. But what happened next wasn't the blood bath everyone expected. Instead, O'Carroll witnessed something far more powerful. Story of honor, redemption, and the kind of strength that transforms bitter enemies into loyal protectors. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The autumn morning painted Oak Harbor, Vermont, in shades of gold and amber as Rose's family diner came to life. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon drifted through the crisp air, mixing with the scent of fallen leaves. Inside, Anna Martinez arranged silverware with practiced precision, her movements reflecting years of morning rituals in this small-town sanctuary. The bell above Rose's door chimed exactly at 7:30 a.m. Thomas Sullivan wheeled himself through the entrance, his movements precise despite his blindness. His dark glasses caught the morning light as Anna approached, her footsteps familiar and welcome. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," she said warmly, already moving to guide him to his regular corner table. "Coffee's fresh, and Rose made those blueberry muffins you like." Thomas's weathered face creased with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Anna. How's Carlos doing?" With his college applications, the diner slowly filled with its morning regulars. Frank Miller from the post office nodded respectfully to Thomas as he passed. Mrs. Florence Stewart arranged fresh flowers in her usual window seat, her flower shop across the street already displaying its morning blooms. Each person carried their own story, their own connection to this quiet corner of Vermont. Rose Wilson emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd owned this diner for 23 years, serving meals and memories to generations of Oak Harbor residents. Her eyes softened at the sight of Thomas, remembering the day 3 years ago when he'd first wheeled through her door. "The usual Thomas," she called out, already reaching for his favorite mug. "Please, Rose, and maybe an extra slice of bacon." Today his voice carried the kind of gentle authority that made people listen without knowing why. Outside, the morning traffic moved lazily past the diner's windows. Deputy Tyler Roberts parked his cruiser across the street, his young face serious as he scanned the area. Something had the local law enforcement on edge lately. Anna refilled Thomas's coffee, noting how his head tilted slightly at the sound of motorcycles in the distance. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but she'd served him long enough to notice these small tells. Quite a few new faces in town lately, she mentioned, casually watching his response. Thomas's fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, a habit she'd noticed whenever he was processing information. Yes, the wind brings change sometimes, Anna, not all of it. Welcome. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, then faded as they passed the outskirts of town. Sheriff Robert Kennedy's patrol car rolled past the diner slowly, his experienced eyes surveying the street. The peace of Oak Harbor felt somehow fragile this morning, like the calm before a storm. Mrs. Stewart approached Thomas's table, her usual morning ritual. "These are for you, Thomas," she said, placing a small vase of fresh carnations on his table. "White ones today. They remind me of hope." Thomas reached out, his fingers gently touching the PP. "Thank you, Flo. They smell like sunshine." The diner conversation ebbed and flowed around them. Regular customers discussed local news, shared stories, and exchanged greetings. But beneath this normal morning rhythm ran an undercurrent of tension, subtle but present. Rose returned to Thomas's table. With his breakfast, town council's meeting tonight, she mentioned setting down his plate. Sheriff Kennedy's requested extra time to discuss community safety. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, his blind eyes somehow seeing more than most. Interesting times were living in Rose. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the diner windows. Anna watched Thomas eat his breakfast with military precision, each movement economical, and practiced sometimes. She caught glimpses of who he must have been before the wheelchair, before the darkness claimed his sight. Those moments reminded her that still waters often ran deeper than anyone suspected. Deputy Roberts entered the diner. The bell announcing his arrival. He approached the counter, his voice low as he spoke to Rose, something about suspicious activity on the outskirts of town, bikers gathering at the old Miller property. Thomas's head tilted again, catching fragments of their conversation. His hands remained steady on his coffee cup, but Anna noticed the slight straightening of his spine, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture. "More coffee, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, already knowing his answer. "Not today, Anna. I think I'll head home early." His voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "Something tells me we should all keep our eyes open today." As Thomas wheeled himself toward the door, the morning sun caught his dark glasses, hiding eyes that had once watched over America's most dangerous battlefields behind him. The diner continued its morning, unaware that their peaceful world was about to change forever. The rumble of motorcycles echoed again in the distance, closer now, thunder on the horizon, bringing with it a storm that would test not just Thomas Sullivan, but the very soul of Oak Harbor itself. The next morning brought steel-gray clouds and the distant rumble of thunder, or what sounded like thunder, until the first motorcycles appeared on Oak Harbor's main street. 6 bikes at first, then 12, then 20, their chrome gleaming despite the overcast sky. The Shadow Warriors had arrived and forced their reputation. Preceding them, like a cold wind demon, Maxwell Kane led the formation, his massive black motorcycle cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. Behind him rode his inner circle, Devil Carson, with his signature red bandana. Shade Roberts scanning the streets with predatory focus. Sullivan Wilson's golden bike reflecting the dim light. Raven Miller taking mental notes of every business they passed, and Venom Thompson, whose fingers never strayed far from his concealed weapons. Inside Rose's diner, the regular morning crowd fell silent as the motorcycles approached. Anna Martinez's hand trembled slightly as she poured coffee, her eyes meeting Rose's across the counter. Thomas Sullivan sat at his usual corner table, his posture unchanged, but his head tilted in that subtle way that told Anna he was mapping every sound, every movement. The bell above the door chimed as Kane and his inner circle entered, leather cuts, creaking boots heavy on the worn linoleum. The air seemed to thicken with tension as other customers drew back, trying to make themselves invisible. Well, C's voice carried across the diner, deep and theatrical. "Quaint little place you've got here." Rose stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "Welcome to Rose's. Coffee's fresh if you're interested." Kane ignored her, his attention drawn to Thomas's corner. He nudged Carson, nodding toward the blind veteran. "Check out the hero in the corner." "Guess they let anyone in here." Thomas continued eating his breakfast, his movements deliberate and controlled, years of military discipline evident in every motion, though few would recognize it for what it was. Sir Anna approached Kane's group, professional despite her unease. "There's a larger table available if you'd like to be seated." "Shade Lion," Kane called to his men, ignoring Anna. "Let's get a closer look at our disabled friend here." They moved toward Thomas's table, their reflection growing larger in his dark glasses. The other diners watched in horrified silence, memories of news reports about the Shadow Warriors' activities in other towns fresh in their minds. "Nice glasses, old-timer." Carson leaned over the table. "Designer brand or standard issue for the blind and helpless?" Thomas set down his fork with military precision. "They served their purpose." His voice carried no fear, no anger, just calm certainty that made Kane's eyes narrow slightly. Outside, Sheriff Kennedy's patrol car rolled past the diner, slowing. As he noted the collection of motorcycles, he spoke quietly into his radio, his experienced eyes taking in the scene through the windows. "You know what I think?" Kane pulled out a chair, spinning it around to sit backwards at Thomas's table. "I think a man like you needs to learn his place in the new order. Oak Harbor's changing. Pops best learn that quick." Thomas' hands remained steady on the table, his breath even. "Every man learns what he's capable of learning, Mr. Kane. Some lessons are harder than others." Kane's face darkened at the use of his name. "You know who I am. Your reputation precedes you." Thomas replied calmly, though reputations aren't always accurate measures of a man's worth. Rose moved closer to the table, coffee pot in hand. Her grip was white knuckled, the pot ready to become a weapon if needed, but Thomas's slight headshake stopped her, a gesture so subtle only someone watching for it would notice. Boss Raven called from near the window. "We've got company." Sheriff Kennedy entered the diner, his steps measured, one hand resting casually near his holster. "Gentlemen, quiet collection of bikes you've got out there. Hope you're not planning an extended stay in Oak Harbor." Kane stood slowly, his leather cut creaking. "Just passing through, Sheriff, getting to know the locals." His gaze lingered on Thomas, "some more interesting than others. Then I suggest you pass through quickly." Kennedy's voice carried the weight of authority, backed by law. "Oak Harbor's a peaceful town. We'd like to keep it that way." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Then Kane laughed, the sound lacking any real humor. "Of course, Sheriff, we respect the law." He turned to his men. "Come on, boys, plenty of time to get acquainted with our new friends." As the Shadow Warriors filed out, C paused at Thomas's table. "We'll talk again soon, old-timer, count on it." The bell chimed as they left, the sound of motorcycles growing louder, then fading as they rode away. The diner remained silent for several long moments, the morning peace shattered like fine china. Thomas Rose approached, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you all right?" "Fine, Rose." He reached for his coffee cup, his movements still perfectly controlled. "Though I believe Oak Harbor's about to experience some interesting times." Sheriff Kennedy watched the motorcycles disappear down Main Street, his face grim. "Thomas, a word when you have a moment." Outside, clouds continued to gather, darker now. The thunder that rolled across Oak Harbor was real this time, nature's own warm warning of the storm to come. But in Rose's diner, as Anna watched Thomas's calm demeanor and steady hand, she couldn't help but wonder if the Shadow Warriors had just made their first serious mistake. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon sun struggled through heavy clouds as Sheriff Kennedy's patrol car wound its way up the tree-lined drive to Tom Sullivan's Victorian home. The old house stood like a sentinel overlooking Oak Harbor, its wraparound porch and detailed woodwork speaking of a different era. Thomas sat in his wheelchair on that porch, facing the approaching vehicle as if he could see it perfectly. "You knew I was coming," Kennedy remarked, climbing the worn steps. "Your cruiser has a distinct sound," Thomas replied, gesturing to a nearby chair. "The timing belt needs adjustment." Bob Kennedy settled into the offered seat, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. "Those weren't ordinary bikers this morning, Thomas. My contacts and state police say the Shadow Warriors have taken over 3 towns in the last 6 months. Protection rackets, intimidation, violence. They're professionals at causing trouble." Thomas's fingers traced the arm of his wheelchair, the movement deliberate. "And you're worried about how a blind man in a wheelchair might handle their attention?" "I'm worried about what happens when they push too far." Kennedy leaned forward. "Your military record may be classified, Thomas, but I've got friends in high places. I know enough to know you're not as helpless as you appear." The wind stirred fallen leaves across the porch as Thomas considered his response. "Everyone in Oak Harbor is helpless if we don't stand together, Bob. That's what they don't understand yet." Downtown, the Shadow Warriors were making their presence known. Devil Carson and Shade Roberts walked into Mrs. Stewart's flower shop, their leather cuts and heavy boots incongruous among the delicate blooms. "Nice place you got here," Carson commented deliberately, knocking over a vase. "Shame if anything happened to it at the VA clinic." Patricia Morgan reviewed Thomas's file, her concern evident as she spoke on the phone. "Yes, I understand the confidential issues, but if the Shadow Warriors are targeting him, I know his history. I treated him after Kandahar." Thomas's home phone rang, the specialized system announcing Maria Sullivan. Before he answered, "Dad," his daughter's voice carried worry across the miles. "I just heard about the bikers. Maybe you should come stay with me in Boston for a while." "This is my home, sweetheart," Thomas replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Run isn't the answer." At the town hall, Deputy Roberts burst into Kennedy's office, clutching a stack of papers. "Sheriff, you need to see this state police reports on the Shadow Warriors. They're not just another biker gang. They've got military-grade weapons, organized structure." C was Special Forces himself, before he was dishonorably discharged. Evening settled over Oak Harbor like a heavy blanket. Rose wiped down the diner counters after closing. The routine familiar but somehow ominous. In the empty restaurant, the bell chimed. Making her freeze were closed, she called out, turning to find Lion, Wilson, and Raven Miller standing in her diner, just wanting to discuss business opportunities. Wilson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Protection services, you might say. These days, small businesses need all the help they can get. Across town, Thomas sat in his darkened living room, phone in hand. The number he contemplated calling hadn't been used in years. Behind him, displayed in a shadow box he never saw, but always knew was there, hung medals that told only part of his story. Kennedy's patrol car rolled past the diner just as the bikers were leaving. Rose's hand shook as she locked up her mind, made up the next morning. She'd tell Thomas everything, but Thomas already knew. He'd heard the entire exchange through the phone line. He'd never hung up after their earlier call in the Shadow Warriors' temporary camp at the old mill. Kane studied photos of Oak Harbor's businesses, marking potential targets, but his focus kept returning to the image of Thomas Sullivan. Something about the blind veteran nagged at his instincts like a warning. He couldn't quite hear. Morgan worked late at the VA clinic, pulling more files, making more calls. Her computer screen displayed a heavily redacted mission report from Kandahar. Only one line was fully visible. Eyeball Lieutenant Sullivan's actions during the incident remained classified at the highest levels. The night deepened over Oak Harbor as storm clouds gathered. Again in his home, Thomas moved through familiar rooms with perfect precision, his fingers brushing the spines of books he could no longer read, but had memorized long ago. One book contained a phone number and a promise made years ago in a place few would understand. Tomorrow would bring choices. Tomorrow would force hand and reveal truths. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of his home, Thomas Sullivan prepared himself for what he knew was coming, not with weapons or plans of violence, but with the steady resolve that had once made him a legend in places whose names he could never speak. The storm was building, both in the clouds above and in the hearts of those below. Oak Harbor stood on the brink of something that would change it forever, and in the center of it all sat a blind veteran who saw more clearly than anyone what was truly at stake. The morning fog clung to Oak Harbor's streets as Thomas Sullivan's wheelchair cut through the mist. His path to Rose's diner as straight as ever. Despite his blindness, the Shadow Warriors had spent 3 days establishing their presence in town, their intimidation growing bolder. With each passing hour, today would be different. Thomas had sensed it in the air, in the subtle changes of sound around him, in the way vehicles slowed as they passed him. Can sat in his motorcycle across the street, watching the blind veterans approach. 3 days of digging had yielded nothing but questions. No social media presence, no easily accessible military records, just whispered rumors and dead ends. The fog swirled around him as he gunned his engine, the sound deliberately aggressive, right on schedule. Kane muttered to Devil Carson beside him, like clockwork. Man's got military discipline written all over him. Inside the diner, Anna's hands shook slightly as she arranged Thomas' silverware. The bell chimed as he entered, but the usual morning greeting died in her throat as 5 Shadow Warriors followed immediately behind him. The diner fell silent, the handful of early customers freezing in place. Quite an escort you've got today, Rose called from behind the counter, her voice steady despite her fear. Thomas wheeled to his usual corner table, his movements unchanged by the biker presence. Kane pulled up a chair backwards at Thomas's table, his leather cut creaking. Been doing some asking around about you, old-timer. Interesting things people don't say when your name comes up, like they're afraid to talk about certain topics. Most people talk too much anyway, Thomas replied, his hands finding his coffee cup with practiced ease. Present company included. The door chimed again as dear Patricia Morgan entered, her white coat pristine in the dim diner light. She faltered for just a moment at the scene before her, then moved purposefully toward Thomas's table. Kane's hand shot out, blocking her path. Doctors making house calls now, Kane sneered, reading her name tag. How touching. VA business. Morgan replied firmly, protected by federal law. I suggest you move your hand outside. A sleek black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted inside. Mike Peterson watched the scene unfold through high-powered optics, his scarred hands steady on the binoculars. His phone lay ready beside him, a number already dialed, but not yet called Dad. Maria Sullivan's voice cut through the tension as she appeared in the doorway, her Boston legal firm's briefcase. Clutched tightly, she hadn't told Thomas she was coming, hadn't wanted him to talk her out of it. Kane's eyes shifted. Between Thomas and Maria, a predatory smile spreading across his face. Well, family reunion, boys, make sure our guests are comfortable, Shade Roberts. And Lion Wilson moved to flank the door. Raven Miller positioned himself near the counter, while Venom Thompson lingered near the kitchen entrance. The tactical positioning wasn't lost on Thomas, whose head tilted slightly as he mapped their movements by sound. Maria Thomas's voice remained calm. "I believe you're late for an appointment." "Not this time, Dad," she replied, moving toward his table despite Devil Carson's attempt to intimidate her with his bulk. "Mom didn't raise a coward, and neither did you at the sheriff's office, Deputy." Roberts burst in with a manila envelope. "Sheriff, you need to see this. Just came in from military contacts. Kane's discharge wasn't just dishonorable, it was after an operation in Kandahar went bad." Same place, same place. Sullivan was stationed. Kennedy finished reaching for his keys. "Call Dr. Morgan now." Dr. Morgan stood her ground near Thomas's table, her medical bag clutched tightly inside it. Beneath normal medical supplies lay a file she'd spent all night compiling, a file that explained exactly why targeting Thomas Sullivan was the biggest mistake the Shadow Warriors could make. "You know what I can't figure out?" Kane leaned closer to Thomas's voice, dropping to a dangerous whisper. "How a blind rates a VA doctor making personal house calls, how he affords a Victorian house on a disability pension, how he moves like someone who never forgot his training." The morning sun finally broke through the fog, sending shadows dancing across the diner's worn linoleum. Thomas's hands remained steady on his coffee cup, but Maria noticed the subtle shift in his posture, a change so slight only someone who knew him would recognize it. "Mr. Kane," Thomas spoke quietly, "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away, not because I'm afraid, but because what happens next might remind you of things you'd rather forget. Kandahar, for instance." Kane's face went white, then red with fury. "How do you know about?" His hand shot out to grab Thomas' collar but froze mid-motion as the blind veteran's head turned to face him with unsettling precision. "The same way I know Raven just pulled a knife by the counter, the same way I know Shade is carrying a gun. He's not licensed for the same way. I know you've got 3 more men outside besides the 2 by your bikes." The diner fell completely silent. Even the usual morning traffic outside seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. C's hand trembled slightly, still frozen in mid-reach. "Dad," Maria's voice carried a warning. "Your phone's ringing." Indeed, a specialized ringtone emanated from Thomas's pocket, a tone he hadn't heard in years. Mike Peterson's finger hovered over the call button in his SUV, ready to summon forces Kane couldn't imagine. "Last chance," Thomas said softly. "Walk away, find another town to terrorize, because if you don't, I'll be forced to make a phone call, and believe me, Mr. Kane, you don't want me to make that call." Sheriff Kennedy's cruiser pulled up outside, followed by 2 state police vehicles. Through the windows they could see Dr. Morgan opening her medical bag, pulling out not medical supplies, but a file stamped with classified markings. "You're bluffing," C snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're just a broken-down old man playing at being dangerous." Thomas's lips curved in a slight smile. "Then why are you sweating, Mr. Kane? Why did your heart rate spike when I mentioned Kahar? Why are you suddenly remembering whispered warnings about a certain operator whose missions there will remain classified for 30 more years?" The morning sun broke fully through the clouds streaming through Rose's diner windows. In that bright light, Kane finally saw what he'd missed before. Behind those dark glasses, beneath the peaceful exterior, sat a man who had once been legend in places where legends got you killed. "Boss," Raven called urgently from the counter. "We got company." "Lots of company." Through the windows they could see vehicles arriving, not just police, but black SUVs with government plates. Men in suits mixed with others who moved with unmistakable military precision. Mike Peterson stepped out of his vehicle, his scared face familiar to Kane from briefings long ago. "Times like these," Thomas said quietly, "a man has to decide what kind of future he wants. The kind that comes from pushing people around, or the kind that comes from finding a better way. The Shadow Warriors leader stood slowly, his leather cuts suddenly feeling heavy on his shoulders. In Thomas Sullivan's calm voice he heard echoes of fur fights and whispered orders of missions that would never see the light of day. "This isn't over," Kane managed, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, Mr. C." Thomas replied, "it is. The only question is how it ends. You decide." The morning had started with fog and threats. It would end with choices that would change not just C's life, but the future of Oak Harbor itself. The war for the town's soul was about to enter a new phase, one that would test not just courage and strength, but the very nature of redemption itself. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oak Harbor's Main Street as Kane stood in the empty parking lot behind the old mill, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. The morning's confrontation at Rose's diner had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The name Sullivan had been nagging at his memory since their first encounter, but now the fragments were falling into place. Whispered stories from his own military days, warnings about a legendary operator whose very existence was classified. Inside the sheriff's office, Patricia Morgan spread photographs across Kennedy's desk, medical records from canned, heavily redacted mission reports, and one clear photograph of a younger Thomas Sullivan receiving a medal that officially didn't exist. The mission that cost him his sight, Deborah Morgan explained, her voice low, saved 38 lives, including Kane's unit. He just doesn't remember because of the trauma. Thomas was already blind when he carried Kane out of that compound. Back at the diner, Maria Sullivan worked her lawyer's magic, turning his into a temporary command center. Her laptop displayed federal regulations and statutes as she coordinated with state authorities. "The Shadow Warriors have violated multiple federal laws," she explained to Sheriff Kennedy, "but Dad doesn't want them destroyed. He wants them rehabilitated." Mike Peterson's network was already in motion. Veterans from 3 states were quietly converging on Oak Harbor, not for violence, but to stand ready if needed. Each one owed Thomas Sullivan a debt that no amount of time could erase. Devil Carson found Kane behind the mill, the gang leader's usual confidence noticeably shaken. "Boss, something's not right. That blind guy, the way he knew where everyone was standing, how he moved. I've seen that before in operators who've been through the real stuff." The afternoon light caught the chrome of motorcycles as more Shadow Warriors arrived at their makeshift camp, but there was uncertainty in their movements now. Whispered conversations carrying on the wind. The story of the morning's confrontation had spread, growing with each retelling. "Heard he was Fork Recon one biker muttered. "Not darker than that," another replied. "Black ops stuff, the kind of missions that never happened." Rose Wilson stood in her diner's doorway, watching Shadow Warriors ride past with less swagger than before. The morning's events had changed something when Raven Miller tried to enter for coffee. She met him with steady eyes. "You want coffee?" she asked calmly. "Fine, but in my diner. You're just men." Leave the intimidation outside. To everyone's surprise, Miller removed his cut before entering. The simple act sent ripples through the watching gang members at the VA clinic. Deborah Morgan received calls from military contacts across the country. "It's starting," she told Thomas over a secure line. "K's record is surfacing. He's not just any dishonorably discharged soldier. He's someone you've saved, someone who lost his way." Thomas sat in his garden, the afternoon sun warm on his face as Maria read reports from her legal contacts. "The state's preparing a RICO case," she explained, "but there might be another way, Dad, a way to save them instead of destroying them." Kane paced the mill's empty interior, memories flooding back, flashes of fire and blood, of a voice in the darkness commanding him to live, of hands dragging him to safety. He buried those memories under years of anger and violence, but they were surfacing now, demanding to be acknowledged. Shade Roberts' approach. Kane cautiously, "Boss, we got word from other chapters. They're hearing stories about Sullivan. Big stories, the kind that make hard men nervous in town." The atmosphere had shifted. Where Shadow Warriors had swaggered yesterday, today they moved with uncertainty. Local residents who had hidden in fear now stood their ground, understanding that the tide was turning. Mike Peterson's SUV cruised past the mill, his scared face visible to Canaan through the fence, a reminder of other soldiers who had lost their way but found redemption. The message was clear. There were second chances for those willing to take them. Thomas's phone rang, a secure line from his past. The dominoes are falling, his old commander reported. Khan's full wreck is being unsealed. He needs to know the truth about Kandahar, about what you did for his men. Maria watched her father's face as he absorbed the news. You're not just going to stop them, are you, Dad? You're going to save them. Everyone deserves a chance to find their way home, Thomas replied. Softly, even those who've forgotten their lost at the mill. C discovered old newspaper clippings in his personal files, headlines about a classified operation, about a legendary operator who went back into a burning compound again and again until all were saved. The dates matched his nightmares, the ones he drowned in alcohol and violence for years. Rose closed the diner early, but not before witnessing something remarkable. 3 shadow warriors had eaten lunch there, peaceful and respectful, their cuts left on their bikes. The change was starting, one small gesture at a time. Sheriff Kennedy met with town council members, explaining the shifting situation. This isn't just about law enforcement anymore, he said. This is about redemption. Sullivan's playing a longer game than any of us realized. As evening approached, Kane found himself driving to the local library, using a computer to search for information. He'd been afraid to face articles about post-traumatic stress, about veterans losing their way, about programs for rehabilitation. His hands trembled on the keyboard. The sun set over Oak Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Thomas sat on his porch, listening to the changing patterns of motorcycle sounds through his town. The rumble of engines carried less menace, now more uncertainty. They're fracturing, Mike Peterson reported, joining Thomas on the porch. Some want to double down, go harder. Others are remembering who they were before. Thanks to you. The question is, which way will Kane fall? Maria brought coffee to the porch, legal papers tucked under her arm. The federal prosecutors offering deals to any who want to clean up, get help, your reputation's opening doors. Dad, Thomas smiled slightly, hearing the distant sound of motorcycles heading toward the mill. Sometimes the strongest men are the ones most lost, Maria. They build walls of violence and intimidation because they've forgotten how to build bridges of standing. The night settled over Oak Harbor, but change was already in motion in the mill. Kane stared at his reflection in a broken window, seeing past the hardened gang leader to the soldier he'd once been, the man who'd been saved by another soldier's sacrifice, only to lose himself in the darkness that followed. Tomorrow would bring more chances for both redemption and ruin, but tonight, in the quiet darkness, the first seeds of transformation were taking root in the most unexpected places, in the hearts of men who had forgotten they were once warriors of a different kind. The war for Oak Harbor's soul wasn't being fought with fists or threats anymore. It was being waged in quieter ways, in moments of choice and remembrance, in the space between who these men had become and who they might yet be. Dawn broke over the old mill as Kane sat alone in his makeshift office, surrounded by printed articles and military documents. His hands trembled as he read the newly unsealed report from Kandahar. The words blurred before his eyes. Unidentified Special Forces operator proceeded to extract all personnel despite sustaining severe injuries. The date matched his nightmares perfectly. Across town, Shade Roberts and 2 younger shadow warriors sat in Rose's diner, their leather cuts conspicuously absent. They watched Thomas Sullivan at his usual table, gathering courage. Finally, Roberts approached, his usual swagger replaced by something closer to military bearings. Sir Robert spoke quietly. Some of us, we've been talking about getting help, about remembering who we were before all this. In the town hall, voices raised in heated debate. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, trying to maintain order as citizens argued about the proposed veteran rehabilitation program. Property owners, worried about their safety, competed with others who saw the chance for real change. These men are criminals, shouted Frank Miller from the hardware store. They're lost veterans, Rose countered, standing firmly, and Thomas Sullivan showing them the way back. Maria Sullivan spread documents across the conference room table, surrounded by state officials and veteran affairs representatives. We can create a legal framework, she explained, pointing to successful programs in other states. Rehabilitation instead of incarceration, therapy instead of punishment. Dr. Morgan sat with Sheriff Kennedy in his office, playing an audio Recording from that night in Kandahar, the sound of gunfire and explosions filled the small space. Then, a calm voice cutting through chaos. Thomas Sullivan, already blinded, guiding men to safety. Kane was unconscious when Thomas carried him out. She explained the trauma. The burns. His mind protected itself by forgetting, but somewhere inside he knows. Mike Peterson's network grew stronger. Veterans arrived quietly, checking into local motels or staying with supporters, not for violence, but to show lost warriors a path back to honor. Each one carried their own story of redemption, their own journey back. From the edge at the mill, the tension grew palpable. Devil Carson confronted C in the main room, his voice carrying to the gathered bikers. We're losing control. 3 more turned in their cuts this morning. This isn't about territory anymore. Sullivan's taking our brothers without firing a shot. C stared at the photograph in his hands, a burned and bloody Special Forces operator being loaded onto a helicopter, face unrecognizable except for the eyes, the same eyes he'd seen behind Thomas Sullivan's dark glasses. Maybe, Kane replied quietly. They're not being taken. Maybe they're finding their way home. Rose's diner had become neutral ground. Shadow warriors sat at tables still wearing their cuts, while others arrived in civilian clothes, choosing to leave their gang identities outside. Rose served them all, watching bridges build over coffee and conversation. Thomas sat with Maria on their porch, listening to her read reports of more gang members seeking help. You knew this would happen, she said, understanding dawning. You knew once they remembered who they were, the gang would start to crumble. Every warrior loses his way sometimes, Thomas replied. The trick isn't forcing them back, it's helping them remember why they chose to serve in the first place. In the VA clinic, Der Morgan received more calls from military contacts. Records were being unsealed, revealing the full scope of Thomas Sullivan's service. Each revelation added weight to his quiet authority, making it harder for the shadow warriors to maintain their facade of intimidation. Lion Wilson found Can at the mill's fence, staring toward town. Shadow warriors are supposed to be about strength, Wilson argued. Sullivan's making us look weak. No, C's voice carried new understanding. He's showing us what real strength looks like. At the diner, more veterans arrived throughout the day, not obvious or threatened, but their presence was clear to those who knew what to look for. A retired Force Recon Marine drinking coffee at the counter, a former Army Ranger reading the paper by the window. Silent support for Thomas's quiet revolution. Maria worked late into the evening, coordinating with federal agencies, the prosecutors offering immunity. She told her father, any shadow warrior who voluntarily enters the rehabilitation program gets a clean slate. The night brought more changes. 3 more gang members surrendered their cuts, asking for help. Others hardened their stance, talking about making examples of the traitors. The shadow warriors were splitting along lines of redemption and resistance. Kane sat in the darkness of the mill, memories surfacing like bubbles in dark water, the sound of Sullivan's voice guiding him to safety, the feeling of being carried through fire, the dead he buried under years of violence and rage. We got trouble, Carson burst in, face flushed with anger. Half the crew's talking about leaving. Sullivan's got them thinking they can just walk away, start over. We need to shut this down hard. But C barely heard him, lost in the reports spread before him, the details of his rescue of the man who went back into hell to save others, losing his sight in the process, the same man he tried to intimidate, not realizing he owed him everything. Thomas's phone rang late. Another veteran seeking guidance, another lost warrior looking for the way home. On his porch, he could hear the sound of motorcycles in the distance, but their rhythm was changing. Some rode with the old aggression, but others moved differently, now carrying men who were remembering who they used to be. Tomorrow would bring more choices, more chances for both salvation and destruction. The shadow warriors stood at a crossroads, each member facing the hardest battle a warrior can fight, the one within themselves. Oak Harbor held its breath, watching this quiet revolution unfold, not with violence or force, but with the steady power of remembrance and redemption. Thomas Sullivan had started something that couldn't be stopped with threats or intimidation. He'd awakened the warriors sleeping within, the warriors reminding them of oaths taken and honor misplaced. And in the darkness of the mill, Kane stared at his reflection in a broken window, seeing past the hardened gang leader to the soldier he'd once been, the man who'd been saved by another Sacrifice only to lose himself in the shadows that followed. Tomorrow would force him to choose between the power he'd built and the honor he'd forgotten, between leading men deeper into darkness or helping them find their way back to the light. The war for the soul of the Shadow Warriors had entered its final phase, and its outcome would depend not on strength of arms, but on strength of character. The question wasn't who would win, but who would find the courage to remember who they truly were. The morning mist clung to Oak Harbor streets as Kane's motorcycle rumbled to a stop outside Rose's diner. For the first time, he'd come alone, his cut unzipped despite the autumn chill inside. Thomas Sullivan sat at his usual corner table, a presence that now seemed to fill the entire room without moving a muscle. Devil Carson watched from across the street, fury etched on his face as his leader walked into enemy territory without backup behind him. A cluster of hardline Shadow Warriors muttered darkly about weakness and betrayal. They'd spent the night planning retaliation against the traitors who'd turned in their cuts. The diner fell silent as T entered, his boots heavy on the worn linoleum. Anna's hand moved instinctively towards the phone, but Thomas's slight headshake stopped her. This moment had been building since the first confrontation, like thunder gathering before a storm. "Your coffee is getting cold," Thomas said quietly as Kane stood by his table, internal warfare visible on the gang leader face. "You carried me out." Kane's voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "Through the fire in Kandahar, I remember. Now you were already blind, but you came back for us." Outside, more motorcycles arrived. Mike Peterson's veterans took up casual positions around the diner, while Shadow Warriors gathered in tight clusters, divided between those watching their leader with concern and others seething with barely contained rage. "Memory is a strange thing," Thomas replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Sometimes we bury the hardest ones until we're ready to face them." Devil Carson burst through the door, leather cut creaking with tension. "This is how it ends, boss. Sitting down with the enemy, having coffee with the man who's destroying everything we built." Kane turned slowly, years of violence and authority wearing with newly awakened memories of honor. "The only thing being destroyed is the lie we've been living." "Carson, look around you. Half our brothers are remembering who they were before they lost their way, like I'm remembering." Morgan arrived quietly, medical bag containing not just supplies, but program documents, contact information for VA support services, paths back to civilian life. She shared a meaningful look with Rose, who began brewing fresh coffee. They planned for this moment. Maria Sullivan's car pulled up outside, followed by Sheriff Kennedy's cruiser, not to arrest, but to protect, to witness, to support whatever was about to unfold in this small-town diner that had become ground zero for an unprecedented transformation. "You're weak," Carson spat, reaching into his cut. "You're going to throw everything away because of some blind vet who got inside your head. Well, some of us still remember what the Shadow Warriors stand for." The weapon appeared in Carson's hand, but before he